So let's have a look at what we mean by parametric modeling in Spoke Creator, and more specifically at how we can present a parametric model to a non-technical user in the browser. Now, a classical example of parametric modeling is a seashell, and usually how it's modeled is by creating a circle and moving the circle to the side a bit and creating a few copies of it. Let's open a parameter window here on the side. And let's take 100 copies and rotate each copy about 30 degrees and scale every copy compared to the previous one by a small factor. And we end up with a bunch of curves that we then can skin into a surface, and we get a shell looking object. So say we want to let the user play with the opening, the size of the opening of this shell. Well, we can look at the polycircle here and modify the radius, but that doesn't really expose the parameter to the end user. The way to do that in Spoke Creator is to create a float, and a float is basically a number, and we give it a value. I think the default radius of the polycircle is about 1, so we'll make the default 1, and I could say a minimum 0.5 and a maximum of 2, and connect that float to the radius attribute here of the polycircle, and we can rename that to the radius of the opening. And now if we select the skin and shift select the float here, we can now modify the radius like this. Now we can do some extra with this float, and we can make it what's called sticky, and that means it becomes a permanent parameter of this scene that we can always access whatever we have selected. So if I select the skin here and I move into presentation mode, you can see that it hides all the complexity of the editor mode and just leaves us with that one parameter to edit. So let's go back to editor mode and see if we can make this a little more interesting for people to play with. Let's first of all create a camera for better presentation. And let's say we want to add a background image to the camera. So let's browse for some images here. Disconnect it from that and connect the right property. In this case, we need to connect a URL to the camera here. And then on the camera, we need to show the background image, and we'll dim that a bit. It's a bit bright. And maybe also give it a bit of a color tint like this. And while we're here, we might as well hide the grid. We don't really need that. Looks a bit too technical, same as the origin. And then we can lock the grid axis to the Z axis, and I'll show you why we do that. We want the user to be able to play with the positioning of the opening. And we can do that by selecting the camera, then shift selecting the translate node here, which exposes the handle of the translate in the view. And we can now start moving that handle around to create some more interesting conical shapes here. And we can expose that exact functionality to the user in the presentation mode by creating what's called a tab. And a tab is just basically a bookmark that remembers which nodes in the graph are selected. Now, a side effect of that is that when we move to presentation mode, we can just click that tab to access that combination of selection, that selection combination, and in this case, let the user move around the opening of the shell here. What else can we do? Let's say we want we want to allow the user to change the shape of this circle here. Well, in this case, we would have to go all the way back to the translate, let's say, and let's have a look at the circle here, and then add in what's called an edit points node. And that allows us to just select points and move them around like this. We'll just insert that here between the translate and the copy node, and do the same thing. Select the camera and shift, select the edit points, and we can now edit the opening and see the result on the full parametric network. And again, we can expose that functionality to the end user just by creating a bookmark for this, a tab, and say edit opening. And now when we switch to presentation mode, we can let the user either edit the opening, the points, or just move the opening around like this. And of course, you can still change the radius of the shell as well, of the opening as well. Maybe one last thing that we can do is actually take the parameter here, the float, and connect it to the camera, which makes it appear as a slider in the view. And we can now go back to presentation mode and even get rid of that sidebar and just work full screen pretty much. So that gives you an idea of a couple of the features that allow you to take a parametric model and present it to a non-technical user in a very kind of convenient way.